Amy Schectman cut her teeth in state government, where her excellence in writing and thinking got her appointed to key task forces on issues like higher education and prison overcrowding. Over the last decade, as CEO of Two Life Communities, formerly Jewish Community Housing for the Elderly, Amy has improved the lives of thousands of older adults with first-rate living quarters and activities. Amy professionalized the real estate team at Two Life, enabling the organization to open a new affordable housing complex nearly every year. During my time as president of Congregation Kehillath Israel in Brookline, Massachusetts, I worked closely with Amy to construct a beautiful new affordable independent living building on the synagogue campus. In the last year, she's led an unbelievably successful effort to keep COVID away from Two Life. Amy's mother and the Grey Panthers were early influences, and she also looks back fondly on her summer camp experiences and her education at Johns Hopkins and MIT. She's charging ahead into the future with plans to address the middle-income market and leverage technology along with the human touch. She makes time for reading every night, with recent favorites like The Secret Diary of Hendrik Groen, the Neapolitan novels, Caste, and The Splendid and the Vile, a saga of Churchill, family, and defiance during the Blitz. I'm your host, David Williams, and I hope you enjoy the show. If your healthcare business or nonprofit needs strategy consulting support, please reach out to me at dwilliams@healthbusinessgroup.com. Great. Well, Amy, it's great to have you on the show today.
Thank you. So delighted to be here.
Great. Well, we're going to start off at the beginning. So as far back as you want to rewind and just talk a little bit about your upbringing. What was your early life like? Who were your big influences?
So I grew up in Stamford, Connecticut, which at the time was really just a suburban community, bedroom community in New York. It was a very pleasant way to grow up. Of course, as soon as I was old enough, I wanted to go into a big city, so I left. My early influence, I would say two things stand out. One is my mother, who was an activist and deeply committed to justice and taking care of other people. A lot of her work was personal, like she took care of one-on-one people whose kids needed help or whatever. But it was a big influence, and she was very social. And then going to sleepaway camp. And that really has translated a lot into work further because, one, sleepaway camp, you get to start all over. You don't bring the baggage with you of the school cliques and the favorites. And it's the ultimate community living experience. And one of my best friends today is someone I met when I was 10 at sleepaway camp. Because
that's pretty cool. I hear stories like that about camp, and I went to sleepaway camp as well. So interested to hear your story. Now, I guess if you grew up in Stamford today, your influences would be hedge funds and high-speed trading firms and all that stuff. Maybe you got out just in time.
I think I did.
And where did you go to camp? Was it more than one, or did you go to one particular camp?
Mohawk, and you better be careful that I don't start singing the Mohawk song. It's a YMCA camp. Interestingly, though, at least half the kids were Jewish at the camp, but it was definitely a Y camp. And that was nice because it was not expensive. I don't remember the amount, but it was really inexpensive. And so it was accessible to a really wide variety of people. And so I met lots of interesting people I might not have otherwise met.
Pretty cool. I went to Camp Airy in Thurmont, Maryland, and it was on the other side of the mountain from Camp David. And there were always stories about people like wandered off the path and the Secret Service would come and grab them and all that. So I don't think those stories were true, but it was a nice place, like up on the mountain, and you could have a nice view. And yeah, so it was good. A friend of mine actually, I went to college with, I saw him later. He was a twin, and now he actually has worked there as a camp doctor for his kid, and he says the hill's not as steep as what we remember, so I don't know.
My ambition when I retire is to go work at a camp again, a sleepaway camp. So we'll see if it actually happens.
All right, well, stay tuned, and maybe we'll do a follow-up episode when and if that happens. Now, so after camp, and I presume you went to high school as well, but then you went to. But I don't like to make too many assumptions. But then you went on from there to Hopkins and MIT. What was that like?
I loved both experiences. I think the kind of theme I would say is I like studying social sciences in a place that's really dedicated to engineering and science, the sort of data-driven policy, the analytics a framework to looking at all problems is very appealing to me. I'm actually somewhat of a math geek, believe it or not. So the kind of rigor, the intellectual rigor that Hopkins and MIT really represent was perfect for me. And I made wonderful friends and retained connections to both institutions.
Well, I think, being a math geek is good because actually you deal with some pretty big numbers in terms of at least the dollars that are required for your current pursuits. And then I think it's also, math is one of those things that when it comes to aging, I think is a helpful thing to be able to, strengthen the brain and to be able to fall back on as well. So.
It is. And that intellectual rigor, the kind of intensity of analytic approach to every problem, I think is also really important for me.
Now, in your career, we're going to talk about what you've been doing lately and for a while at Two Life Communities. But before that, a number of roles, including a number of governmental roles that I think a lot of my listeners won't be so familiar with, since we tend to be more on the business side. But it would be great just to step through a couple things that that you had done, just what those roles were, and what you learned and what you were able to accomplish there.
I'd love to. One of the advice I give young people starting out is if you can work in government early in your career, because the problems you're going to deal with are massive and important. The resources you're going to have are minuscule, and you're going to learn a lot about how to do a lot with little. And because of that, there is no incentive to keep you in your little box. If you can do your job and two other jobs, they're going to let you do a million other things. And so my professional growth happened at an exponential rate because I was willing to work really hard, and no one wanted to stop me because we had such big problems to deal with. Now, I say that with the one caveat that it totally matters who's on the top of that governmental entity. My first job was with Michael Dukakis. He was governor, and a brilliant man, a phenomenal governor who believed we serve the people, and he was doing it by bringing the best and the brightest in every topic area. And so the people I got to work with as a very young 25-year-old coming right out of MIT, my eyes were popping out all the time, and I learned so much. And I did a lot. I mean, I guess a few things that I learned that relate to advice is, one is writing is such a critical skill, and you can hone it. Because someone high up in the governor's office noticed something I had written, they wanted me on various task forces so I could write up the recommendations. So I got to work on the governor's strategy for addressing mental illness, and the governor's strategy for higher education, and the governor's strategy for dealing with prison overcrowding, lots of different issues in these big task forces that had secretaries of different departments all working together to come up with a common solution. And I just got picked out because of something I had written, and that was thrilling to get to do that. And what you also learn in government is that how to bring people from point A to point B, because everyone came into all of those interagency groupings with their own agenda, appropriately, with their own vision of how to do things, their own way of looking at the world. And the governor wanted a single recommendation that spanned different disciplines. And so you learn really quickly how to be multilingual. You can speak engineering, you can speak architect, you can speak prison guard, you can speak, the different languages, and listen really carefully and find those points of commonality and intersection and bring people along together. And it's a wonderful skill you develop in government if you have a good leader like Michael Dukakis. Or when I worked for the town of Brookline, we had some phenomenal selectmen when I was there. And you can really move things so well because the problems are big and the resources not enough. So you get real creative and very energized because the problems you're dealing with are poverty, child neglect, childhood education, opportunities for all, pretty exciting things.
I never had a chance to have a real considered conversation with Governor Dukakis. I actually ran into him once at South Station, and I think he must have been dropping his daughter off. I think she was going to Brown at the time. So it occurred to me later. you just saw him, and I know that's somebody I know. I said hi, he said hi, and that was it. So if I'd known he was going to be there, I would have prepared something to say. But
he lives in Brookline. I just ran into him last weekend, actually,
yeah,
at a store, and he's the same. The minute he saw me, he said, "Hi, Amy." So, and then he gave me a whole lecture about what the state government was doing right and wrong about COVID management
yeah.
right now. And boy, is he on top of everything. He's amazing.
Now, Amy, there's something that you said that was a little perplexing, and I want to just ask you a little bit more about it, which was talking about being in government and having very few resources. Now, often I think people in business might consider, hey, I'm in business, I don't have extra resources, I have to make a profit and so on, and government has the power to tax and spend and so on. Does it have to do with being in state government or working in sort of social areas? I think of usually, people who work for certain government agencies like the Defense Department, usually have plenty of money to throw around. What could say a little bit more about the resources? That's certainly what I understood, and I have understood about government service, is you can have a very senior responsibility at an earlier stage in your career than you could otherwise, and you can kind of run with that. But just the resources, could you just unpack that one a little bit more?
Well, it's the resources relative to the task at hand. So, for example, let's take housing, because that's where I'm working right now. So we know Massachusetts ranks 49th out of the 50 states in terms of elder economic security because of high housing costs. And yet we have resources in the housing field to meet, somewhere between a third and a half of that need at most. And so you have to figure out how to prioritize and how to get things out to stretch dollars as far as you can, but you're never going to get enough. Every area I've ever worked on, you're always the money seems like a lot. Like when I worked in public housing, I think I was working on $400 million a year on the public housing and rental assistance system. Sounds
like big money.
Sounds like a lot of money. And yet when you break it down into the units of service, and here's a really good example. So we were funding, Massachusetts has really the most sophisticated state public housing system, and then you've got a federal public housing, and you oversee all of that. And so we did put a lot of money into it, but when you looked at the per unit amount we were subsidizing, and now I'm in the private nonprofit sector, which has a different subsidy stream coming from the federal government, we were giving them per unit 1/3 of what I'm getting now as a private nonprofit from the federal government. And I will tell you right now, 1/3, what I'm getting is not enough to do the smartest things that we would want to do as a matter of public policy. For a quick example, if we could get higher resources into the housing we build, we could really just about abolish nursing homes, because we could provide all the kind of care at 1/10, 1/8 of the cost it puts us into nursing homes. But the federal government has these silos. There's a Medicaid silo, there's a Medicare silo, there's a housing silo, and ne'er the twain shall meet. And so even with the resources I'm getting now from the federal government, it's not enough to take it to that. That's why I have to raise a lot of private philanthropic dollars every year. And I'm getting 3 times what we were giving people in public housing. And
Right.
So what do you expect to happen? Do you expect some deferred maintenance? Do you expect something? Yeah, because we say as a society, what we believe it takes to run housing is this. And then the ones that are only government subsidized get much less than that. So that's what I mean. It's not that there wasn't a lot of money. I was kind of awed by how much money there was. But then when you break it down, compared to the size and the scope of the problem, you're nowhere near.
Yeah.
And you, yes, technically have the power to tax, but there are so many things government does that are trying so hard to solve such big, important problems that there's never enough. There's never enough, because we don't, there's enough in the Netherlands and in Sweden and in Denmark and in countries that believe in government and give people a quality of life so they don't have to save every single penny for their kids' college or for their own retirement. And so those people actually financially do better than we as a general population do, but we don't believe in government that way here. And so we don't resource it in a way that allows those problems to be really solved, as opposed to just do the best you can.
So let's catch up to the present a little bit. So just over a decade ago, I don't know if it's hard to believe. I don't know if that sounds like a long time or a short time, but that's when you made the jump over to what then was JCHE and now is Two Life Communities. What were you expecting when you did that, and what was it like when you got there?
Um, it's hard to remember what I was expecting. I think it was always a well-respected organization that took a great care to respect and honor our collective mothers and fathers, and I wanted to continue to do that. Um, Great focus on affordability, and the median household income, for example, in our portfolio is $11,368 a year. That's median household income. Um, and so if people didn't live with us, they wouldn't have a good life because there's nothing you can buy on the marketplace for
No.
housing services. And so I think I just wanted to make it work. And I had deep respect for the person who had run it before, and she asked me to come over there. That was important to her, that she turned it over to somebody she trusted and cared about. She had dedicated almost 30 years of her life to that. So there I went, and I think I found great stuff and stuff that you could really build on.
Yeah.
So, for example, there was no professional real estate department, which meant we could take on one project every 5 or 6 years with volunteers. So with a waiting list of about 10 times the number of people as apartments we have and a 5 to 6% year turnaround, that means more people are going to die waiting for an apartment than will get it. That's not right. So we wanted to really accelerate that process. And to do that, we needed a real estate department. The other thing is we weren't on long-term solid financial footing, and it felt fragile. For example, if the government had stopped paying the rent for even 2 months, we would have not been able to pay any of our bills. And that was the year, you may remember, there was sequestration and
I
then
remember that year. Yeah.
government shutdown. And so we were in too vulnerable a position. So I was able to reorganize how we are so that we have some long-term financial sustainability. And I think infuse some energy into the employment policies. We have very low turnover and keep people happy. And even though we have gorgeous buildings, really what makes To Life home is the staff, is the people, the energy. We did a survey, and number one of the things they loved is everybody knows my name.
Yeah.
Every staff knows who I am. They know where I come from. They know what's important to me. And so spending some time really building employee culture that is based on the concepts of mutual respect and mutual accountability, and working on that. So we've been busy. We've been doing lots of stuff. It feels like a really important place.
No, that's great. Well, as these crises come and go, and we'll talk about one of the big ones in a minute, but I remember the sequester, and in our consulting business, we don't do a lot of work with the government, but we had a contract with NIH, and I remember they just sent this email. They said, stop working and don't send me an email, because if I respond to an email, or if I'm doing business, I could be like violating the law. And it was shocking. Now to us, we have 5% of our business with that. And it was just like, okay, I guess we're not going to move to 10% or 20%, but it's just nuts, actually. So I remember that one. So have there been some, you already talked about, some of the big things you've done on an operational standpoint, and kind of some of the principles. Are there any kind of, themes that you would summarize over the past few years that kind of drive your work beyond what you've already described?
Well, I think a deep commitment to social justice, a belief based on a lot of evidence, our own experience, but also academic evidence, that every older adult deserves, by right, the opportunity to live a full life of connection and purpose in a dynamic, supportive environment. That's what we do, and we do it with a laser sharp focus on affordability. That drives, I think, what we're trying to do. We consider it tragic, literally tragic, when older adults who have worked their whole life to build our communities, to do the right thing, who have such accumulated wisdom and knowledge and curiosities, and we hang them out to dry. We don't care as a society about them. That feels tragic, and we're not going to let that happen. We're going to work like crazy until every older adult has that opportunity.
Amy, you and I actually had co-authored a letter to the editor of the newspaper because there was an article that basically said, "Hey, it's old against young for limited housing," and we really kind of, rejected. You and I rejected that way of thinking about it as sort of a zero-sum game, or somehow it's the old versus the young. How have your thoughts on that come together?
Oh, couldn't agree with you more. I mean, it's a system, and when it's working well, you know, what do they say? A rising tide raises all local boats, or something like,
Yeah.
and to the extent that older adults are provided with the right opportunities to age in community, to live in a setting where they're loved, cared for, and empowered to live their best lives. When you have that situation, people will come into that setting and free up some of the housing that's just sort of out there on the private market and allow that turnover in young families. And certainly that's how our family bought a house. There was a couple, they had aged out of their housing, and therefore we were able to get into Brookline. So I think it's a beautiful system. And the other thing to remember, and this is a more global financial picture, that as long as we as a country, as a society, don't find appropriate places for our older adults to live safely, financially viably, with the kind of care they need. Thomas Friedman actually wrote this piece in the New York Times saying that we are headed on a path, because of our failure to invest in the proper housing and home care services for older adults. We're on a path that soon the majority of our entitlement spending in the federal government is going to go to nursing homes and war. That's going to be it. We're going to crowd out all the other needs. So even if your issue is preschool, if we don't address some of the needs and opportunities for our older adults, that's going to get squashed right out of the federal budget and the state budgets. So I think they're all very interrelated.
When you look at the last decade, any of us sort of driving around Brookline and elsewhere can see some great developments that you've done, and people are living, and you say that they look like great spots. So those are the kind of the, I guess, obvious things from the outside. And you said it's the buildings from the outside, but things like everybody knows, your name and so on the inside. What do you list as sort of your key accomplishments and any kind of disappointments that have come along the way?
And I'm going to answer in the reverse order because um, I think your next topic is COVID, and in the accomplishment,
Yeah.
really want to relate to COVID. So disappointments, my big disappointment is the lack of recognition in the larger society of the value of um, nurturing and loving community for our older adults. When I was growing up politically, and I mean, in my late teens and early 20s, there was the Grey Panthers. And I don't know if you remember Maggie Kuhn. I remember it
Yeah.
vividly, and she was a force. And we're in the middle of the largest demographic shift in the history of the world. We're going to see more older adults than ever before, and more than children. I mean, it's huge impact. And we don't have the right voices speaking for that. And as I said, it's an integrated system, so everyone loses out. And I want another Maggie Kuhn to appear and to have that forceful voice that really needs to articulate and demand justice. And so accomplishments, I mean, I mentioned a little bit that I feel having a professional real estate development and allowing us to build at the pace we're now building, which is basically bringing on another affordable housing development almost every year, and looking at the gaps in the marketplace, which I think we'll probably talk about in a minute, about the middle income. So those are really important. I think a lot about employee culture and respect. For example, we raised our own minimum wage to $18 an hour, which I wish it was higher, but at least we did that. We have a hierarchy that people pay for their health insurance based on their salary. So some people are paying as little as 7 or 9% of the premium, whereas the highest earning people are paying 25%. So it's a cross subsidy. We also, when I recognize that the people who are depositing into the 401k plan that we have, that we match, I noticed, well, surprise is the lower paid employees were the ones not being able to do that. So I said, that's not fair. So we stopped that. And now everyone gets on top of their salary 3% automatically. We put that into a 401k, and then of course we match above that. So a whole lot of equity and justice issues within the culture. But I think it's hard not to talk about COVID right now in terms of accomplishments, because I just calculated the answer. So we worked very aggressively, and we can talk about it if you want, of what we did really aggressively to keep COVID out of our buildings, to keep our people safe, because congregate settings are known for being, closer.
COVID zones, exactly.
And then our median age is 82. So, I mean, you've got high risk all around you. And I just calculated that over the entire pandemic so far, only 4.6% of our folks contracted COVID, all from outside, by the way, but 4.6% compared to 8.7% of the general population, and 47% of people living in nursing homes. And while 20% of older adults who are the same age living in nursing homes died, we had less than 1% die. I miss every single one of them. I don't want to reduce them to numbers, but we kept a lot of people alive. And I'm really proud of us for doing that.
And Amy, there's clearly some specific things that you did for that, but I think, and those sort of things are well known about, what you'd have to do. But what is it about kind of the organization and culturally, that enables a 2Life to be able to do that when, other organizations did not have that success, and presumably also were interested in keeping people alive and safe. But, where does that stark difference emanate from?
That's a really good question. I mean, one thing is that it hit us at a time where I had been there 10 years. So we had built up reserves for emergency, which didn't exist when I got there. And we had a substantial emergency fund. So we didn't ask questions like, what's cost effective? How do we weigh this versus that? And I remember like the first week saying, you know what? I'm not going to look back and think there was anything I could have done to say that. I just can't look back. So that was number one. And number two is a philosophy, which is we don't see ourselves as just housers. We don't see ourselves as responsible only for providing safe, clean, warm housing. We see ourselves as making sure our older adults have that opportunity to live a full life of connection and purpose. And when you see that bigger picture, then it becomes very clear what your opportunities are. And we just went at it with a vengeance and a sense of purpose, did a lot of things, including we hired our own epidemiologist, because we were getting really pitifully little help from the feds, the state, the local governments, who were all independently overwhelmed by what was hitting them. So we had to learn it and go it all on our own. So we wanted that science guiding what we did. I think that's the reason. I mean,
yeah. Okay.
We became the best.
You were ready for it, and you went after it, which is great. Well, let's look ahead. And so where are you going with 2Life? Where is it heading? And I think also I think we can't, you said before $400 million seemed like a lot. And I think Biden has in the infrastructure plan, $400 billion tapped. Of course, not all for Massachusetts, not all for 2Life, maybe none of it, for helping people to be at home. So there's definitely a higher level, not just dollars, but a consciousness about it. But like, where do you see your organization heading, and in the broader context of how these things are being prioritized and addressed?
Sure. So where we're heading, I would say there's three big buckets of ambition. The first is we're going to continue to create and accelerate the rate at which we create a supply of community nurturing housing that's affordable to everyone for whom the market is failing. So that's two big buckets within that. One is we're doing more deeply subsidized apartments, because there are 3,344 households on our waiting list.
Wow.
And as I said, more of them, if we don't accelerate the process, more of them will die waiting than come in. And, with a median household income of under $12,000 per household, there are no market options. So we've got about 210 affordable units about to start construction now, and about 300 more in our immediate pipeline, and we'll keep building that. The second is in the market, you're better off being really poor or really rich. And if you're in the middle, you're kind of screwed right now. There are no really good market options that provide this aging in community model that we have for the middle. And there's good reason. It's a conundrum. You can't charge enough rent to support the services you need to provide, but you can't get any government money because they top out. So we're going to create the first one. We're about to start permitting that, and we've broken through this model with 3 components: volunteerism by everybody, proximity to other things, and partnerships to reduce cost of services. So that's number 1, create supply community nurturing housing. 2 is really about changing the image of senior housing so that people aren't falsely lulled into this ideal of aging in place, which we understand leads to loneliness and early death. And they understand aging in community as the first choice, not the last resort. So we have a whole bunch of initiatives under that category, including opening our doors to people in the neighborhoods to come see what we do. And then the third big bucket is to maximize the ability of our housing to keep people in for their full lives. And that is where the healthcare side comes in. I mean, some of what we do, we have full-time people who live in the building 24/7. So when someone pulls their emergency cord, someone they know who's on the staff is in their apartment 2 to 3 minutes later. Last year, we avoided 90% of 911 calls and emergency room visits, right? So we're adding a lot of value to the healthcare. We have some partnerships, and we want to continue to build more partnerships to extend in-home services and partnerships with insurance companies and providers, because everyone is better off in our society if we can keep people in the aging and community model, if we can help them stay there and get the supports and services they need. And the silos of government funding make that much harder than it needs to be. As far as the Biden plan, I mean, I'm waiting to see when. I mean, it's exciting. It was the right amount of money to really address this issue, and we're all waiting to see.
Yeah, good. All right, to be continued. Now, as we look ahead, obviously the older generations are people who now, either if they didn't grow up with technology, they, it's not so far from them, and they certainly used it in their working lives, and if not before. Plus, just technology, is advancing. How do you see technology playing into the lives of older adults broadly, and then as it relates to the kind of work that you do at 2 Life?
Increasingly, and during COVID, we did an accelerated investment in technology. We have lending libraries of tablets, and we became facile at lots of online offerings. And I think some of that will stay. I think we helped a lot of people with telehealth, and I think a lot of people found that very rewarding, and we're going to continue to support that. And there's just no substitute for in-person. So it will be things like telehealth and some things, lectures that we can have online, just so that people at Golda Meir House can hear what's happening at Brown House and vice versa. So we'll continue to accelerate our process and the opportunities, and it will change generationally too, as more people.
Any chance to work with your old colleagues or others at MIT with their aging lab and so on? I mean,
we're doing a lot of we're collaborating with the aging lab, and I have to say, during COVID, an MIT team led by a professor named Simon Johnson has been absolutely critical in helping us get testing, helping us advocate for vaccines, helping us understand the risks. And there's a whole MIT squad behind him that were really phenomenal. And I think I talked to him probably every day, including Saturdays and Sundays, for about 6-7 months there. And the Age Lab's very interested. We just wrote a piece. They're doing a series on becoming a longevity hub, and they're very interested in our housing model for the piece of housing that's part of the longevity hub. And so we just wrote a piece with Joe Coughlin, and we're continuing to work very closely with them.
No, that sounds great. So final question is, first of all, if you've had any time to read anything, and if you have, if you've got anything that you recommend to listeners.
Sure, I read every night, no matter what. So I tend to read nonfiction, although there's been a couple of, I tend to read fiction, but okay. So the two fiction ones that I've just loved lately is something called The Secret Diary of Hendrik Groen. And it's a Dutch guy who's writing a diary of what it's like to live in what's their equivalent of assisted living. And it's really funny and powerful about the needs for community. And I think it makes the case for aging in community well. In fact, I had a trip scheduled the third week in March to go to the Netherlands and meet this author.
Okay.
So intrigued, but of course, COVID took that away. And then, of course, the Neapolitan novels by Elena Ferrante are the best novels written. I love them. And she just wrote a new one, The Lying Life Adults, which I liked. I also just read Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, which I thought was brilliantly structured, although we know all the stuff in some ways. It was really well cast. And I also just read The Splendid and the Vile, which is about Winston Churchill during the Blitz. And that I'm always looking at leadership skills and trying to hone my own and learn from others. So I recommend all of those.
Those sound good. We'll put them on the list. I haven't read any of those, but that will be a good list to start with. Well, that is terrific. Well, Amy Schectman, President and CEO of Two Life Communities, thank you very much for your time today, and thank you very much for what you're doing for our older adults in our community.
Thank you. I'll take you to Brown House soon.
You've been listening to the Health Biz Podcast with me, David Williams, President of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.